Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. My name is Kris Goldsmith, and I'm filling in for my buddy Ken today. You might recognize me as a frequent guest on this show. I come on to talk about extremism and rising fascism here in the United States and what we can do to fight against it. And in a week when I know a lot of people are struggling because a fascist, Donald Trump, is going to assume the role of the president yet again, I want to offer some good news. I want to offer an update on something we've talked about on previous episodes. And that is that one of the neo-Nazi organizations that Task Force Butler Institute has been researching and fighting against for years now has just been hit with a nearly $3 million judgment against them for committing a hate crime against a victim in Boston. So let me tell you how this happened. The mission of Task Force Butler Institute is to train veterans in open source intelligence research so that vets can learn the skills necessary to gather evidence of criminal behavior by extremist organizations like Patriot Front. And we have done just that. And as of this week, we've been shown to be tremendously expensive for these neo-Nazi organizations. So here's how this happened. Independence Day weekend, the summer of 2021, those U-Haul Nazis, right? Those guys who wear the Best Buy uniforms and carry shields and white masks over their face because they're cowards. These guys marched, about 100 of them, through the streets of Philadelphia. And they did so on a mission. They were going to seek out conflict, ideally with a person who presented as a racial or ethnic minority. They would commit violence against that person. They would use video of that violence as propaganda material and recruiting material, and they would get back into their U-Hauls and leave the city. Well, they did just that. They sought out a conflict and they committed a racially motivated violent attack against a black man. They surrounded him. They threw down a smoke bomb and they beat him with weapons. They have used images and videos of that bloodied man ever since in their propaganda and recruiting material. Less than a year later, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Patriot Front got back into rented U-Haul trucks and were headed to a local community event. And they had the objective of committing assault there against the LGBTQ community. Again, with the objective of using that assault and getting away with it, as they usually do, as propaganda and recruitment material. Their objective here is to intimidate vulnerable populations around the country. And when they get away with this kind of thing, it works. Now, thankfully, in this instance, a concerned citizen apparently saw them loading into a U-Haul, and they called police, and police stopped them before they were able to make it to the event. And the leader of that organization, Thomas Rousseau, a committed neo-Nazi, he had their plan written down on paper in his pocket. So when they were arrested, they had the planning documents. They had the written out conspiracy to engage in violence against the local community. And some of those members of Patriot Front were successfully prosecuted by the city's attorney. 1 month after that, Independence Day weekend of 2022, Patriot Front attempted to do the same exact thing that they did in Philadelphia a year prior. They used their U-Hauls, they carried their weapons and their upside-down American flags, they wore their Best Buy uniforms with their helmet underneath their hat, and they sought out a violent conflict with someone who presented as a minority. Well, an innocent man, an African-American musician named Charles Morrell III, was walking down the street. He was going off to perform his art. And as he was walking down the street, he looked up and he saw a column of men dressed all alike walking towards him. He went to take out his phone so that he could record it. He didn't know exactly what he was looking at. And before he could even realize what was going on, he was surrounded. Thomas Rousseau, the leader of this organization, ordered his men to march around him, eventually surrounding Mr. Morrell, beating him and preventing his escape. They beat him with these steel shields with sharp edges, sending Mr. Morrell to the hospital. Now, unfortunately, and very frustratingly, there was law enforcement on the scene. And rather than do anything about this, they basically said, okay, move along. Mr. Morell was denied justice when justice should have been almost instantaneous. Members of the Boston Police Department, members of the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force stationed in Boston were present for that. There is body camera. There is plenty of video footage. Photographers, journalists were present recording this. And despite the violence, despite the the law enforcement on scene knowing that it was racially motivated violence, they didn't do anything in the moment. They didn't detain Patriot Front. They didn't detain the members who were carrying shields, who assaulted a black man, based on his race. They just let them walk free. Now, Task Force Butler Institute was created in the beginning of 2022, and our first research project was Project Blacklisted. We released it just a few months after these incidents in September 2022. And our objective was to make it so that we would present evidence to journalists, to law enforcement, and to victims so that Patriot Front would be held responsible. Now, while law enforcement has failed thus far to do anything for the assault in Boston, again, which was witnessed by law enforcement, which was on video, in which Patriot Front recorded and then posted themselves as racist propaganda, law enforcement has still not done anything. But yes, justice was delayed. But Mr. Morell found justice this week. This week, in federal court in Boston, Mr. Morell was awarded nearly $3 million in damages. Found responsible was the leader of Patriot Front, Thomas Rousseau, the organization itself, and John Does 1 through 99, the other anonymous masked members of Patriot Front who were marching, some of whom actually committed that violent assault. The reason that Mr. Morell was able to achieve this was because Task Force Butler Institute had insider knowledge of Patriot Front. We analyzed their leaked documents that anonymous anti-fascists had made available to the public. We did the legal research to help establish how these crimes were committed and how Thomas Rousseau, as the leader of this organization, trained his members to engage in exactly this kind of provocation and execution of violent hate crimes. In our report, we established how Patriot Front uses these shields, which they present to the public as some sort of defensive thing, but they use these shields offensively. They use them marching into crowds, seeking out conflict. They use them to, as they did with Mr. Morell and the victim in Philadelphia the year before, to surround them and beat them and immobilize them, to detain them unlawfully. In Project Blacklisted, Task Force Butler Institute established that there was a clear pattern here, that they sought out this racist violence, and that after the fact, Patriot Front would use it to intimidate the local population, to intimidate the victim, and to intimidate anyone who would stand against them. Now, thankfully, despite a coordinated harassment campaign by Patriot Front, its members and its supporters against Mr. Morell was brave enough to stand up and say no more. Mr. Morell took Patriot Front to court. He filed suit, and as of this week, he is owed nearly $3 million by Patriot Front because they were found liable for conspiracies to violate Mr. Morell's civil rights. Now, here's why this is important. Up to this point, Thomas Rousseau and Patriot Front had committed these kinds of violent acts, again, engaged in conspiracies to commit hate crimes, without any really serious repercussions. In the case of Idaho, where they had a conspiracy to riot against a community event, only a few of those members who were present were found guilty, and only a few of them served any time at all. Thomas Rousseau, the leader of the organization, who again had the plan, the conspiracy written down in his pocket, he was not convicted in Idaho. And law enforcement letting Patriot Front get away with this time and time and time again has made them feel like they are operating in a permissive environment. It has made them feel these members of Patriot Front, these neo-Nazis, like they could go anywhere in this country and they could seek out violent conflict, racially motivated conflict, engage in it, and then walk away while law enforcement witnessed it and refuses to do anything. Well, Mr. Morell, through his bravery and his commitment to justice, he spent a few years teaching Patriot Front this lesson, that not everyone will be intimidated. Not everyone will stand down in the face of the terror that they are trying to rain through vulnerable communities throughout the United States. Mr. Morell was awarded these damages because he refused to submit. His justice was delayed, but ultimately it was not denied because he kept fighting. He kept fighting for what was right, not just for him, but for the next victim. Because now Thomas Rousseau and Patriot Front and nearly 100 other members, they are responsible for $3 million in damages. And as they are identified and tied to this event, each one of them, these John Does 1 through 99, are going to have their lives absolutely ruined, because that is a tremendous amount of debt, and it will follow them for the rest of their lives. Task Force Butler Institute's Project Blacklisted identified several members of Patriot Front who were on the ground, who were present at the Boston attack against Charles Morell. And I look forward to each one of those who we've already identified being dragged into court and held responsible. Those John Does 1 through 99, they're going to start turning into real names. And that is because Mr. Morell stood with it. He withstood direct harassment, intimidation, and violence. And despite all of this, he faced down hate and did not blink. So I want Mr. Morell to be an inspiration to you. As Donald Trump, a fascist, assumes the role of president in less than a week, we all must face down hate and refuse to back down, refuse to blink. Task Force Butler, we will not be intimidated. We will continue doing what we're doing. We will make it difficult and expensive to make the choice to be a neo-Nazi. As Thomas Rousseau, Patriot Front, and 100 of its members just found out this week, it is very expensive to make that mistake. And we know that Donald Trump and his buddy Stephen Miller are going to try to undermine the FBI and the DOJ's attempts to dismantle these racially motivated, violent extremist organizations. But we as Americans, as civilians, we have a First Amendment right to speak out. We will continue gathering evidence, providing analysis that proves that there are conspiracies behind these hate crimes, and they will be held responsible. Whatever walls are put in front of the FBI and the DOJ over the next few years, remember that we have the states, and we can continue to fight through every court available. And where criminal law doesn't do it, where police refuse to make arrests for violent hate crimes that they witness, as they did in Philadelphia and in Boston, civil courts in the states and federally will still be holding these neo-Nazi organizations responsible. So don't despair. Don't give up. The next 4 years are going to be rough, but know that you have friends, you have allies, and we are going to work as one to find justice. Donald Trump will not always be president, and he will eventually face justice. And we, the victims of his abuse of power, we will find justice as well.